Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app, and remember you can get in touch with us at podcast@klassiki.online. Thank you. It's been far too long since we had a new film to savour from Julia Loktev, the Soviet-born American director of the brilliant dramas Day, Night and The Loneliest Planet. Now, 14 years after that latter film, Loktev has returned with a monumental new documentary project. My Undesirable Friends is her collective portrait of some of the last independent journalists working in Russia in the run-up to and aftermath of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Part 1, entitled Last Air in Moscow, was shot entirely on iPhone during Loktev's trips to the Russian capital. Over more than 5 hours, we follow journalists from the TV channel Rain and other oppositional outlets as they struggle to keep pace with Russia's descent into the abyss. It's an immersive and gut-wrenching account of the state's attacks on opposition media and free thinking, from labelling journalists as foreign agents to outright assault and arrest. My Undesirable Friends Part 1 is currently screening at select locations across the US. So I sat down with Julia to find out how the film evolved over time, the relationship between her work in fiction and documentary, and where she's currently at with part 2 of the project, entitled Exile, which follows our journalist protagonists after they are forced to flee from Russia. Check the links in the show description to find upcoming screening dates and locations for My Undesirable Friends Part 1 in the US. This is not a film that you're going to want to miss.
Hi, nice to talk to you,
Hi,
Sam.
Julia. Thanks so much for taking the time. So I've just finished watching your fantastic film, and my head is spinning. It's an amazing piece of documentary work. It's incredibly dense, and it is also very long, as I'm sure is the one thing people immediately point out. So I was sat there trying to think about how best to talk to you about it, to question you about it. And one thing I was thinking as I was watching it is, it's rare to see a film where you can feel the kind of form of the film justifying and necessitating itself as you go along. It's obviously a very long film, over 5 hours, and it's divided up into these 5 chapters. And as you're watching, each chapter starts to inform the others as you go along, as the characters that we're spending this time with start to become overrun by events. And that was the idea I had in my head. It's a film about being overrun, if you like, by events, by history, if you want to call it that. So I guess to turn that into a question for you is, you initially went back to Moscow to film your friend Anna Nemtsa and to make a film, as I understand it, about some of these independent journalists who were working in Russia. And then obviously what you've ended up with is something much more expansive and much thornier. So how, as you were filming, did the sense of what you were doing evolve, if that makes sense? Like, at what point did you start to get a sense of the scope of the project, the shape, and how did that kind of start to affect the way that you were filming?
That's a great question. I should back up and say it is long, but it's anything but slow. I think
Oh,
sometimes people
absolutely,
associate
yes.
long and slow. It is the fastest moving thing. And so fast that people kind of sometimes have a hard time keeping up. I've also been told it's kind of very bingey. And, so it's not, I think when I think of a long film, I think of something very meditative. And it's definitely not that. It is
No.
really just, I think the New York Magazine described it as a 5.5 hour panic attack. I said, I don't know if that's a selling point, but I'm not sure people want to have a panic attack for 5.5 hours, but it is sort of like that. Yeah, I started out making a film in the fall of 2021. about Russian journalists who were being declared more and more foreign agents. At the time, there were only about 25 individual foreign agents. It was still something very, very new that was just happening. And I went to Russia to make a film with Anna Niemzer about this because we thought there's something deeply disturbing when a society forces journalists and activists also to start marking themselves as foreign agents in everything they do. They had to mark themselves as foreign agents in all their professional work. Like, let's say you were declared a foreign agent, you'd have to start this podcast and say, hi, I'm Sam, I'm a foreign agent,
The current
which
podcast brackets material, close brackets, is,
exactly.
and so on and so on.
Exactly. It was in more legalistic, less friendly terms. It was like the following material has been, you know, produced and or disseminated by a source of mass media functioning as a foreign agent. Basically it was basically you had to start everything by saying, hi, I'm a foreign agent, which does not generally add to one's credibility. And this also, well, it wasn't just like their professional work, it wasn't just their articles, their broadcasts, their podcasts, but they had to mark their Instagram cat pictures with a large all caps disclaimer saying they were a foreign agent. It also was, it's like Hollywood credits, that specifics that this has to be in a larger font than anything else. So if you had a headline, the hi you over I'm a foreign agent part had to be bigger. So it was always in these like kind of all caps screaming at you. And anytime a foreign agent appeared on TV, for example, they had to be introduced with, you'd be introducing me as like, and now we're talking to Julia, who we must say is a foreign agent. Like, and it was getting to the point where this was really, if you were watching a show on Russia's last independent TV station, TV Rain, it started to get to the point where every other word was like, who we must say is a foreign agent, these interjections, because otherwise you get fined, you risk being closed, you risk getting arrested after a certain number of violations. And this was deeply, deeply disturbing. But of course, what we didn't know was that 4 months later, Russia was going to start a full-scale, horrific war in Ukraine. Nobody knew that. I mean, the war had been going in Ukraine, at a kind of low key way, since 2014. And which by that point was like 7 years. Everyone was strangely, I'm not saying they should have been, they should not have been, but weirdly, the world had become accustomed enough to that level of war, enough to let Russia host a World Cup in the middle of it, And somehow this was acceptable, but the idea of like bombing Kiev, Russian tanks rolling into, trying to, it just was unimaginable to everyone, to my characters, to me, to everyone I knew up until the moment it happened. And so what ended up happening is I was in Russia filming these characters, and it's very much a character-driven film where you live through this experience with people. It's a lived experience film. It's not an information film. As all of this kind of crackdown, as the screws were tightening in Russia, and yet still people didn't know what was happening up until the first week of the full-scale invasion, where in 1 week, Russia shut down all independent media, made it really impossible to tell the truth. I mean, calling the war a war was illegal. You really had to do every single thing you said had to be, followed by the Russian Ministry of
Yeah.
Defense.
There's
That's
those
it's like,
scenes where TV Rain is in the first week of the war, TV Rain is speaking to Ukrainians who are in bomb shelters who are describing what's happening to them. And then the host on TV Rain has to say, of course, we must declare that the Russian Ministry of Defense denies. It's just completely obscene, obviously. Yeah.
it's completely obscene, of course. And they keep, in this first week of the war, they keep trying to like just get one more day of reporting. They're like, can we buy one more day to tell the truth? We just get, and it's this constant negotiation of like, how do we keep getting the news out there? I mean, the first night of the, full-scale war, TV Rain, issues this incredible anti-war statement, and continues to try to tell the truth. But of course, 1 week in, completely shut down, and everyone has to flee the country in one night. And that's what I ended up capturing, unfolding literally in real time as people were living through it, as people were facing decisions like, are we going to work tomorrow? No, go to the airport, get a carry-on suitcase, go to the airport, get out of Dodge, get out of here. And so I feel incredibly lucky as a filmmaker that I kind of walked into this story because I started covering it early.
Mm,
I started filming early where people were facing, these decisions that I remembered, like, thinking like, what if you could film in 1935 in Germany, when people first had to mark themselves? And people were facing decisions. Is this a big deal? Is this shameful? Not shameful? Can we do this? Can we not do this? Do we leave tomorrow? Should we have left yesterday? And that's a really tough decision, when you're in a country that is increasingly making opposition impossible. How do you keep working? How do you know when the time to leave is?
yeah. Yeah, that's the sensation. Obviously, watching it now, several years after this footage was captured, it rings and sings with these horrible historical ironies that are kind of layered into it, which obviously at the time, you and your heroes couldn't be aware of. And yeah, watching it. So the first week of the full scale war is part 4 of 5. So there are these 3 earlier chapters where we kind of
4 and 5, yeah.
immersed in goings on, and watching them in 2025, these early chapters, people are literally saying, well, every day I wake up in a worse country, and I can feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, but of course, I don't think there's going to be a kind of full scale war with Ukraine. Almost literally these words, right? And especially part 3, which is kind of the new year, 2021-22 celebration. You're at different kind of parties and celebrations, and everyone's making an effort, like on TV Rain, to be hopeful, and they're kind of proclaiming all these messages of optimism for the year ahead. I had a tear in my eye. It was really, like you say, knowing when chapter 4 starts up, what these people
Of
are going to be
course.
faced with. It's really
You're watching this knowing what happens, and you're watching characters that don't know what's coming, and that's devastating, I
how
think.
do you, when you sit down with all of this material, how do you go about structuring it, given this historical irony? I guess is my question. I mean, how are you forced by the kind of unfolding of events to treat the earlier footage differently or otherwise?
I work by really studying the footage. I edit one chapter at a time. I mean, obviously, I know what happened from filming it, but really, it's like focusing on that one chapter. I say, okay, here's the things that belong to this time frame. Here are the things that I think might belong in here. And then I really just whittle down every scene. And I think that's important to mention because it's a kind of unusual for a documentary. It's structured in scenes.
Mm,
I mean, most documentaries, it's not really scenes. It's, you're cutting between interviews, archival footage. This, I've made both fiction and documentary, so I didn't really approach this any different than I would a fiction film in that way, that it's a scene followed by another, it's very obvious it's a scene followed by another scene followed by another scene, where you're with people in a particular moment, feeling that moment, feeling like you would, if as if it were a fiction film. What would you be seeing except it is devastatingly real. So I really work by whittling down each scene onto itself. And then, we are going there's not a lot of flexibility in terms of moving things around because it's like the story's perversely linear.
mm,
You can't just jumble time, like things happen in that particular moment and they belong to that particular moment. So it's really going, one step after another step after another step. But of course, one of the things to mention, and maybe I should back up a little bit and I'll come back. I'll circle around to this point. Let me see.
sure.
I think one of the reasons I was able to make this film is I'm very much an insider outsider, which is a really
Mm,
unique
right.
perspective.
Yeah.
I was born in Russia. I was born in St. Petersburg. I speak accentless, if sometimes funky Russian, but I speak, Russian to my mom. But I've been in the States since I was 9 years old, so I haven't lived in Russia, since the 70s. Um, I know Russia, but I know it as an outsider. So I'm very aware of like, how do you tell this story? I'm aware of the things that people don't know.
Yeah.
My goal was like, how do you tell this story to people who aren't particularly interested in Russia, who probably can name, Putin, Navalny, who else is there? Not sure.
Medvedev, there's
Like,
some talk about it.
maybe can't name a single Russian woman. That was sort of it. It's a film all about women. So I said, I want to be able to communicate what happened at this historic moment to Russia and to Russians and the opposition, to people who don't, who aren't familiar with Russia. Now, what ended up happening is, of course, in the last eight, I'm counting, losing count, and however many months since January, this film has really transformed in how it's been seen. Like the
Right.
world has transformed around it with Trump and how we're thinking about authoritarianism. So now I have all of these Americans who are like watching every moment of like part one, part one in the beginning when it's the crackdown, when it's not the invasion, but it's all the little signs. And they're recognizing little details, the things that, didn't have particularly strong international resonance then, like suddenly a line, suddenly like, this comedy show being canceled, the end of comedy shows suddenly has a resonance. Now, it didn't have that particular resonance when we were editing. It was just one more crappy thing happening, as
Yeah.
Russia cracked down on media. Or, for example, there's a Russia in the process of the film. Russia shuts down the oldest NGO, the most kind of this historic NGO,
Memorial, yeah.
Memorial, that dealt with the preservation of memory of political repression in Russia. And one of the things, when reporting on the story, TV Rain says, quotes the judge that says something like, why must we, the victors over Nazism, be ashamed now of our history? And then I look at Trump at the Smithsonian, who's like, why must we be ashamed of our history? What is all this like talking about slavery? Can't we talk about the nice things? And so many things in the film, I think, are now taking on a resonance that they didn't have either. I mean, of course they had a resonance at the time, but they seemed
Yeah.
localized, and now so much of that is having a broader resonance. And of course, there's shots, when I'm going to circle around to the question you asked me, is how does this affect the editing over time? There's things, that I wish I had included. There's one line, for example, there was a little bit where Anya, one of the main characters, at the end of chapter 2, she went back and started talking about how when Russia invaded or annexed Crimea, there were all of these supposedly nice, respectable, decent people who signed a petition in support of this.
Yeah.
And each one of them later said, they had a theater to protect, like they signed it, because they didn't want to lose their whole theater or their whole whatever, they had some reason to make this compromise. At the time I was editing, I cut this line out, not because it wasn't interesting, but because it was more interesting. Right before that was a scene where there's a lawyer, a media rights lawyer, and a journalist calls her asking about filming, tanks gathering near the border of Ukraine. And that seemed to move the story much further. I was like, let's not go back to 2014. Let's,
Yeah.
move closer to the full scale invasion. But now I'm like, darn, I really wish I would have kept that line about making compromises, because again, that's something that has a different resonance now that we see people kind of acquiescing in ways here. And by here, I mean in the States. But that's so it can't help but shift. It will continue to shift, through no work of my own as the world shifts around it. And I think that's kind of what I hope is that, it refracts in different ways from different
Yeah.
angles.
I mean, just personally, I think, again, watching it now, I almost, after the full scale war began, it was a kind of event horizon, and it became difficult, even as someone who's been a Russia watcher or a Russia visitor for a long time. It became difficult to really remember even the kind of immediately preceding, kind of period. So I was grateful in a way to be reminded of these things, and the Memorial closure really hit home hard. I mean, that was for anyone who's, any Russian will with that kind of civic sensibility is aware of quite how profoundly disturbing that was. I remember being in the Memorial offices in St. Petersburg in, I don't know, 16 years ago, and so Anyway, that's just a little personal there, which I'm sure many Russians will be
Yeah,
able
absolutely.
to share.
And in the film, I mean, they're just kind of like there's this scene that I find quite, because on the day that Memorial was closed, they were also having their holiday party,
Oh yeah, of course.
and so they try to get together and say, how joy and community will be part of our resistance. They try to put on a brave face, and I find that beautiful.
There's quite a lot of parties in this in the film, aren't there? For given the
Well, so one of it is it is around New Year's,
that's true,
which I
yeah.
think Anya points out is a kind of really the only real holiday.
Mm,
It's the one holiday. It's like it takes on kind of a religious mythic meaning in Russia because it's the holiday of renewal. It's kind of you throw in all the things of Christmas, but then with New Year's and this thing where you're constantly hoping the next year will be better,
yeah.
a miracle will
There's
happen.
that point where they're singing the parody version of if you don't have an aunt, which is a song from the famous Soviet era New Year's film as well. A nice little Easter egg for the
Yes,
Soviet
exactly,
movie
exactly.
heads.
They're saying it kind of exactly. If you don't have any foreign bank accounts, and there's still get a chance to get a named a foreign
Yeah.
agent, but it's based on the irony of fate, which I love. I was just talking about that film.
Just going back to the editing. So I was reading an interview where you were talking about your work with your co-editor Michael Taylor, who we should give
Mhm.
props to, obviously. And you said that sometime towards the beginning of the process, Michael had said to you, as you're kind of sitting there with all this footage, well, I'm just going to edit it like a fiction, which is again something you've just mentioned here. I was interested in what exactly that meant beyond. I don't know. Is that a question of like linearity? Is that a question of finding narrative? Because as I understand it, all the scenes that you filmed are in the film. They've just been kind of condensed and distilled, right? There's not
I
lots
mean,
of
there's some
B-roll or
scenes
anything
that didn't
lying
end up
around
in.
somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. There's not a lot of film scenes that I didn't. There's some, but it's not usually. It's literally like you hang out at someone's house for 7 hours and you end up with a 3-minute scene. It's more like that, but it's not. I most scenes I filmed ended up being included. A few, just nothing happens, so you don't include them. Yeah, it's part of it is that I think what Michael meant then, and I think it's very true with how we work together. We're interested in people. We're interested in their faces and their emotions and humans. And so I think what he actually said is like, I think what he actually said was, I'm going to edit them as if they're actors.
Right.
That
It's a
was
slightly
exactly what
different
he said.
inflection.
So
Yeah.
it's a quote which is a little different. It wasn't about the structure of it, but it was literally like, are you feeling the person on the screen? What are they communicating to you with it? It's no different. I mean, obviously they are real. I don't want to say it's no different. There are obviously ethical considerations, etc. But as a viewer, you're experiencing a person on a screen, and are you connecting with them? What are all the different kind of facial expressions that they have communicating to you? Are you feeling them?
Hmm.
And that's important to me because all of this, you can learn a lot about Russia and what the hell happened to Russia by watching this film. But you're not going to learn it the way you usually might with some, again, so many films, you'll have some expert in a hotel room they've never been to sitting there giving you an expert interview and explaining this. This is literally like if you went somewhere, if you went to pre-war Moscow and you had a really brilliant friend and she took you to her friends' houses and you hung out with them and they were just talking about what's going on in their lives. And then a lot of crap started to happen and you lived through it with them. You would get information that way through osmosis by really just hanging out with people. Like it's like when you travel, you learn so much. And when you meet people just by talking to them
Hmm.
and them taking you into their lives. So I think that's how the film works.
And is that's presumably also a function of it being shot entirely on iPhone, with even with I believe you had like a what is it, 58 millimeter lens at certain points attached. But even with that, the iPhone kind of necessitates filming in close up in a way that
I mean, well, it doesn't, you could film from a distance. I mean, you don't have to film in close up. It's just not very, doesn't look that
yeah, well,
great. I
yeah,
mean, I think it's my instinct is to film in close up because I'm interested. I mean, all my films are really about people's faces in a very intimate way,
yeah,
like that connection you make with people. And I am ultimately interested in kind of how things have an emotional response,
yeah.
and that's But what the iPhone forces you to do is if you want to film in close up, you actually have to be physically very
I guess
close
maybe
to the person.
that's more what I meant,
That's
right?
what
It's
it is.
the
It actually physically, it's not
proximity.
so much a close up, but with a longer lens with most cameras, you can stand across the room, be
Mm.
in the corner, and get a nice, zoomed in close up on this. With the iPhone, I mean, I practically had to be on people's laps. I mean, there's one shot where there's three girls in the back of we're waiting for someone to be released from a police station. One of the characters was
Yeah, I was
arrested
gonna say
while
those scenes in the back of a
Fred
car.
in the back of a car, and we're waiting like all night. We spent waiting for him to be released from the police station from a protest. And there were three girls in the back of a cab warming up because it was so cold. We were standing that we literally called a cab to sit in it, just
Yeah.
to sort of not freeze to death and not go anywhere. And they're sitting there talking, and people are like, "Where were you?" And I'm like, "I think I was sitting on one of their feet." Like at the bottom, like literally, I'm short. I'm 5'3". I fit in a lot of places. So I really was able to be very physically close to the characters. And I think that creates an intimacy, which is really, to me, the most important part of the film is that you feel a connection
Yeah.
to the characters and a closeness.
Yeah, watching that sequence, I was obviously very immersed in it, and then at a certain point, I found myself thinking, "Hang on a sec, I'm in the back row. I'm in the back seat of a car with three people, but there's also someone's holding a
The
camera
camera
here. Where is the
sitting on their
yeah?"
feet, in that little area at the bottom.
The
Yep.
you mentioned there the idea of a kind of a travelogue kind of approach to Moscow or something, or approach to these people. And one thing I really appreciated was almost accidentally or incidentally, maybe is a better word. There is actually quite a strong sense of Moscow in this film, but always seen through car windows or through office or flat windows. Like I it's been a long time since I've been to Moscow, but I was getting a real kind of Proustian reverie from all these high rises and traffic jams. Was that at all intentional, or is that purely kind of incidental? The sense of the city as a location.
I mean, everything in the film was really kind of discovered organically. I mean, I knew I'm not the type of person like, I'm not gonna, shoot drone shots of
Sure.
Moscow or,
Good luck trying
you
that
know,
anyway.
good luck that now. I know the minute I said drone, I was like immediately like there was something quite triggering about this. Um, but I was like, I'm not going to do like large panoramas or as many filmmakers would do, even just cutaways of the window.
Mm,
In fact, there's one time in the film that the camera actually pans out the window, which I really wouldn't usually do, and it's a shot filmed by one of the characters,
right.
Darlene, like, because I thought like I would never really just pan to a window usually.
Well, these people don't
Um,
sit still enough
I
to have any of
No,
those kind of
no, exactly.
contemplative window shots.
But a lot of filmmakers like shoot, cutaways. They shoot other things that are not the characters. I shoot the characters, but the characters are in cars and the characters are walking and they're standing on their balconies, that where you can see Moscow. So you see it's always
Yeah.
present there, like as you said, in the window. And there was a lot that was really discovered super organically. There's a part of this where, Anya, who is the main character and starts her, she takes us into this world. And one of the things we see is she kind of narrates, I mean, a story in a sense. She's like our guide into this
Yeah.
world. But a lot of this happens in cars, as she's driving. Now, and you see Moscow in the background. We didn't sit down and plan and say, like, listen, you're going to drive and you're going to tell me stuff. Like, literally, the first day of filming, okay, the second day, I mean, I arrived, I filmed this dinner party. The next day, there was something at TV Rain. She was driving to TV Rain. Traffic in Moscow is so slow. It
Mm,
takes so long to get to places. I was like, might as well film. And then it was this amazing discovery because they're not really monologues. I don't know what to call them, but she does this kind of narration where she tells a story as we have these driving scenes in Moscow. And we just ended up, anytime we had to get somewhere, I just filmed her and it ends up kind of forming part of the structure. But pretty much everything was really discovered that way. I didn't have a lot of time to plan the film at all because, as soon as I read this article about people being declared foreign agents. I said, I want to do something. I got in touch with Anya. She gathered people. At the time, Russia still wasn't giving visas, tourist visas due to COVID. So I had to wait a
Yeah.
few weeks. It would have happened even sooner. I literally got a visa and jumped on a plane, I think, the next day and just started filming. I said, I don't know. I told everyone, if I know what this is going to look like, there's no point in making it. And I wasn't even sure I was going to film it myself. I wasn't sure I was going to film it, how, what. But I just started filming and it felt so right.
Yeah.
All of these things felt, when something feels like, okay, this is the way to do it. And then you just go with it. And I think that's the best way to work creatively. I mean, you're going on instinct, but especially the best way is when it's working.
One thing I did really want to ask you about is almost all of the kind of main characters. I feel bad using the word characters, but the main
It's
personages in
funny,
the
I
film,
use the word characters
are
too.
women, and there is this through line, this like this I don't know what the word is, not theme, or maybe this idea that recurs throughout the film, not really overtly, about kind of I don't know, violence against women, or like a kind of patriarchal militaristic aspect to like what's happening to Russia. And I found that very kind of compelling, but like I say, it's quite low key. It's never really like insisted upon. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Yeah, like about this through line about the I don't know, like the women's position as women in everything.
Well, not, well, first of all, Russia doesn't have a law against domestic
Yeah,
violence.
as they bring up in
Some of the activists have been trying to pass one for years. Um, and of course, it's a deeply patriarchal society, but one of the things that we tried to do was subtly weave all these threads of like the issues that our characters work on and that are important. For example, Anya had a show called Who's Got the Power that focused on different activists, who were trying to create a better Russia, a Russia with respect for the dignity, not only, of women, but also, for example, of people with disabilities, like Russia
mm,
institutionalizes people with disabilities, there are very few penalties for beating your wife. All of this is part of a system of violence. Russia has declared the so-called international LGBT movement an extremist and terrorist organization now. All of these things are related. The war doesn't
yeah,
happen in isolation. And I think one of the things we try to do is very subtly weave how these questions, even with Memorial, how a society tells its own history, how a society treats the vulnerable. All of these things are part of a culture and part of a society in an authoritarian society that it's part of what enables the war. The war did not, it didn't come out of nowhere. And I think we try to weave all those threads together. And of course, yeah, in our case, all the characters are women. It didn't start out that way. There were a couple of men. It just happened to be, first of all, like there's a hugely dominant proportion of women in Russian independent media.
mm,
Often you have like the head editor will be a man, and then everyone else almost is women. It's really like you walk into a newsroom, it's a lot of women. And then, it just happened. I continued to follow the characters that I connected with. It was also a situation where the male characters that I filmed they were the editors, and they were, a few of them had already been forced out of
yeah,
Russia in the fall. They'd been searched, they'd fled a little bit earlier, and we ended up focusing on characters who were in Russia until the very first week of the war, kind of stayed until the last moment. But of course it has an impact because they let you, it's how they experience the world, it's how they let you into their lives and how you connect with them. And absolutely, those questions, I think that it's actually on Anya's show. It's at the beginning. There's a quote from a woman who is an activist working on domestic violence. And she specifically says that, violence against women it's connected to this idea of power, because either you say, this is allowed, you basically can say, like, okay, those who have power can do anything.
right,
That is the undercurrent of modern Russia.
yeah. And just very quickly to kind of swerve in a bit of a different direction, very briefly. This is part one, Last Hour in Moscow, and as I understand it, you are still editing. Is that right? Part two, which I believe is titled Exile, which follows these characters again now dispersed across. I think you said you've been in 14 countries. Is that right?
Something like that. At some point, I
So
stopped
where are
counting.
we? Where are we now with part two? What's going
I
on?
just finished editing the fourth of 5 chapters
Okay,
of part
great.
two. So we're getting close. So yeah, I mean, this was, not only did I get to capture this historic moment kind of the last days of the when it was possible to be working in the opposition openly in Russia and opposed, speaking openly against the war, which is incredible luck as a filmmaker to capture this live, I think. But then I continued filming, the part one ends with everybody fleeing Russia. And then part two begins 2 days later in Istanbul as people have no idea where they're going. It's like yesterday we had a media. Yesterday I was an anchor at TV Rain. Now I'm a loser in Istanbul, one of the characters says. And it's really getting to capture. I mean, obviously other societies have also gone through like a quick mass wave of an
Yeah.
exodus. And I was filming this live as it happens over the last few years, as people fled, having no idea what country they were going to, with their media shut down, try to get back up on their feet, continue because all of these journalists are opposed to the war and continue to see it as their mission to bring an alternative to propaganda, to continue to tell the truth about war crimes. And, they all rebuilt their media. They all continue to work in exile. Many have now criminal cases against them. Several have been labeled extremists and terrorists, have cases of fake news or discreditation of the army against them. Many would be arrested if they went back to Russia,
Mm.
but none of them can go back now for years. And so to me, that's a really interesting story. Super, super interesting because, of course, it doesn't, things don't end the minute you leave. There's this, and then how do you keep working after? How do you keep doing the work?
Well, I can't wait to see it. I can't wait to continue this story. We'll have to end it there for now. But Julia Loktev, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us about My Undesirable Friends, Part 1, Last Day in Moscow. And yeah, we look forward to Part 2.
Thank you so much, Sam.